Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a delight to be here. And I want to talk tonight about some of the themes raised by the New Atheism. And I want to say, first of all, how very glad I am the New Atheism has raised some questions, because these are things that are really interesting to discuss. And one of the things I've noticed, and indeed many others have noticed, is that public interest in the God question has soared since the publication, for example, of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion back in 2006, or Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great in 2007. And so in many ways, I suppose I should begin by thanking them for getting such a good conversation underway. I think many commentators would say that while they've got a conversation underway, the conversation certainly has not stopped where they would like it. And in fact, it's moved on into some very interesting directions. So in this evening's lecture, what I want to do is to explore some of these themes. I think a very good point at which to begin is by asking, well, what is this New Atheism? What is the difference between the New Atheism and what we might call the Old Atheism? And try and work out what this is saying and where these ideas take us. But also, I think, being aware that the New Atheism didn't just arise from nowhere. It arose within a cultural context, and I think understanding that context helps us begin to appreciate some of the emphases that we find within the movement. So what I want to do, if I may, is begin by sketching the background to this. And I think a very good place to start is to go back to the 1960s, which I can do with the greatest of ease, but I think some of you here tonight won't be able to do this at all, not because your memories have failed, but simply because you weren't there. When I was growing up during the 1960s, I was an atheist myself, and I was an atheist for many reasons. I think one of them was that I was studying sciences, and it just seemed to me to be the most obvious of all obvious things that science, in effect, removed any grounds for belief in God. But there was also something else going on in the 1960s, especially in the late 1960s. And that was this very strong conviction that within a generation, religion will be dead. In other words, this generation, i.e. the 1960s, will be the last generation to, in effect, inhabit a world that is shaped or influenced in any way by religious beliefs. And a huge number of sociologists have reflected on this. This is Rodney Stark and William Bainbridge talking about the expectations that were dominant in both American and British culture at that time, where in effect they were saying, look, it was our belief that religion will be gone. The most illustrious figures in sociology, anthropology, and psychology were of the view that they would live to see the dawn of a new era in which the infantile illusions of religion would be outgrown. Now, the problem about prophecies like this is that if you live long enough for them to have meant to have been fulfilled and they aren't, it does raise some very interesting questions. And certainly one of the issues I'm going to explore with you tonight is basically, is the New Atheism, at least in part, a response to the persistence, or in many parts of the world, the resurgence of religion when the theory said it shouldn't be there at all. But of course, as I think we all know, the real springboard for New Atheism is what we now call 9/11, the terror attacks in New York City and elsewhere. And I think in many ways these are the event, the moment that brought the New Atheism into existence. And certainly at least 3 of the 4 main writers of New Atheism, which I'll introduce in a moment, would say that they responded to this specific event. For example, Sam Harris talks about beginning to write his book on the day after 9/11. So this event, if you like, is a trigger. Now, I'm going to say to you, there's more to it than this. It's not just an event, there's a broader context. But this event, I want to suggest to you, really helps us understand how this got off at the particular time it did. And the phrase, the 4 horsemen, is very widely used. It's reference, of course, to the last book of the Bible, the 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse, but it's been adapted very creatively to refer to the leading 4 figures of the New Atheism. If I was giving this lecture in the United States, and if there are any US listeners tonight, don't get me wrong on this, all of these names would be well known. Here in Britain, I think we only really know 2 of these. Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and therefore I'll be focusing particularly on them tonight. I think they are, if I may say so, the best of this lot, and their arguments are the most interesting, and therefore it makes entire sense to engage with them in particular. Basically, we're looking at a movement that really began about 2006, and I think peaked in 2007. So 5 years later, really, we can look back, look at its arguments, and then ask, where is the debate going now? So looking at 9/11, this is what Richard Dawkins said very shortly afterwards. To fill a world with religion or religions of the Abrahamic kind, he means Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is like littering the streets with loaded guns. Don't be surprised if they're used. I think we see here one of the core themes of the new atheism, namely that religion is intrinsically dangerous, that it takes ordinary people and somehow messes them up so they become potential terrorists. And certainly that is a cultural anxiety. And I think there's a serious point here, no matter how overstated it may be. And we need to look at that, and we will in the course of this evening. And what I want to do, if I may, is map out some of the ground I hope to cover. I'm going to look at 4 issues. First of all, trying to understand where its anger comes from. It's very hard not to read, for example, Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, without noticing that Hitchens is angry. So why the anger? I think it's very important to appreciate that. And again, that issue I raised right at the beginning. What is different about this movement? Atheism's been around for a long time. What marks this particular kind of atheism out? And thirdly, trying to assess how influential it is, very interesting point. And then I think most importantly, and this will be the bulk of my lecture, responding to its concerns. What I'm going to do is look at 3 major concerns that I think are very significant and well worth raising, and I'll be exploring those. And then, if you feel I've left anything out, we'll have time for a discussion after the break. So I hope that will map out a reasonably interesting evening. Let's begin with the anger issue. And I think it's helpful to go back to that point I made about these great prophecies of the 1960s that religion would simply disappear. And as you all know, it simply hasn't. If you want any evidence for that, you might look at the presidential campaign which brought President Obama into the White House. And what you will notice is that both the Democrats and the Republicans were very big on issues of faith. Faith is a good thing. It enhances cohesion within America. It provides motivation for programs of public works. It's something good. And both candidates were very happy to talk about their personal faith, seeing this as politically really very significant. 40 years ago, you wouldn't have done that. And you can give many other indicators. There are many books with titles like, for example, The Economist journalists' very interesting book, God is Back. In effect saying, whether you like it or not, God is back, and the impact of this on global politics really needs to be looked at very, very carefully. So there is an issue here about these prophecies that said religion is going to die away. I think the point I want to make is it's not simply the inconvenience of this. You know, religion is still here, it ought to have gone. It's something deeper than that. If your meta-narrative, that is to say, if your big picture, your overall theory of the way things are, says religion is going to die out in a generation, and it doesn't, if anything, it's slightly bigger, you know, clearly there is an issue here about the credibility of your theory. I think that is one of the reasons lying behind the anger. The resurgence, the persistence of religion raises questions about the plausibility of this narrative which portrays religion as a gradually disappearing entity from the world stage. And really, it's not an issue of whether you think religion is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just trying to work out what is going on. And so it raises the question as to whether this meta-narrative might be wrong. And there's another point which I think really is very significant. I think if you read in particular Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, you'll notice how it's very strongly modernist in its outlook. very strong emphasis on reason, very critical of what we might call the postmodern turn in modern culture. And of course, that is generating a very interesting perception, which is that atheism actually is linked with the rise of modernism. So it therefore raises this very interesting question: what happens when postmodernity in effect inverts some of the most fundamental judgments of modernity, raising questions about the modernism that seems to be built into leading new atheist writers? For example, those of you who've read Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, will be aware that the last chapter is really a manifesto for going back to the Enlightenment. In other words, let's go back to the early modern period and enjoy the ideas it developed. And of course, the problem for most of us who've actually worked on these ideas is that people have had to abandon those ideas, not because they're reactionary, the people that is, but because they don't stand up. That really postmodernity is not simply a reaction against these ideas because they're believed to lead to some bad places. It's also because there's a very strong sense that these ideas simply are wrong. So I think there is an issue there which needs careful attention. So I think that we need to just note this point: the survival of religion is really quite significant. But let's move on now and try and look at what is distinctive about the new atheism. And clearly, as I was saying a moment ago, atheism has been around for a very long time. So we need to ask, why is this movement branded the new atheism? And I think we can make a distinction between various kinds of atheism. One very simple distinction might be between a committed atheism and an atheism of indifference. An atheism of indifference is saying, well, you know, this God stuff, I don't want to get into that. I'm not talking about it, I'm not thinking about it. And in effect, this is about a refusal or a disinclination to really think about the God question. And you could quite easily say that somebody who is disinclined to think or talk about God is certainly, at least in some sense of the word, an atheist. But it's not an atheism of conviction. For an atheism of conviction is saying, you know, I've thought this through, and it's very clear to me there is no God, and therefore this is in a rather different place. And I'd like to suggest the new atheism is a committed atheism. They thought this through, and they don't believe in God. So where does this phrase, the new atheism, come from? Well, it was invented back in 2006 by the journalist Gary Wolfe. Not a name I think many of you will know. He wrote for a magazine called Wired, which some of you may read, I don't. It's branded as being for trendy young people who want to know what's happening next. And I'm afraid I'm at the stage in life where I tend to remember what used to happen and find thinking about the future a bit difficult. But anyway, clearly the new atheism is what's happening next. And Wolfe was very, very good at trying to delineate the main features of this movement as one who was very sympathetic to it. And this is what Wolfe has to say. Gay politics, he writes, is strictly civil rights. The point he's getting at here is that some are saying, well, a new atheism is simply a kind of atheist liberation movement. Let atheists be taken seriously in public life, like, for example, the gay liberation movement. But Gary Wolfe is raising questions. Gay politics is strictly civil rights. Live and let live. But the atheist movement, here he means the new atheist movement, by its own lights has no choice but to aggressively spread the good news. Evangelism is a moral imperative. Dawkins does not merely disagree with religious myths, he disagrees with tolerating them. Now, I think that is an important point to make, because certainly many older atheists are profoundly unhappy about this aggressive and intolerant tone. And again, many atheists I know would say something like this. We don't believe in God, we understand you do, but the world's big enough for both of us. Live and let live. Your views must be expressed in the public domain because that's important. Ours must too. So it's really a question of just respecting each other and getting on with life. But that's not what you find in the new atheism. The new atheism is actually quite aggressively dismissive of religion. You know, if you are a religious person, then you are mad or bad or sad or possibly all three. And I think that that is one of the features of the movement that is really quite distinctive. And I want to raise the question about how other atheists feel about that in a later part of this lecture. So we might, I think, pick up on a theme from Greg Epstein, an American humanist writer that some of you may have come across. Here he is raising real questions about the damage that this new atheism is doing to traditional forms of humanism. And he says, look, atheism is a lack of belief in any God, but anti-theism, which he sees as being at the root of the new atheism, means actively seeking out the worst aspects of faith in God and portraying them as representative of all religion. And again, those who've read Dawkins and Hitchens will know exactly what they mean. In effect, it's all about taking the worst possible representatives, the mavericks, the fanatics, and saying these guys are mainstream. In other words, it's all about using the pathological and portraying it as if it's the typical. And Epstein is very concerned about this. Anti-theism seeks to shame and embarrass people away from religion, browbeating them about the stupidity of belief in a bellicose God. So in many ways, what is new about the new atheism, I think, is its tone. The aggressiveness, the dismissiveness, the intolerance, which you don't necessarily find in an old generation of atheists. But I want to suggest also that there is an element of celebrity culture to the new atheism. And again, what you might notice is how a number of individuals have been kind of way sprinkled with stardust. People like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. And these are almost like celebrities whose words are to be treated as oracular. That in some way they're telling things the way things are. And certainly there are a number of sociologists of religion who are saying that the new atheism sounds awfully like a new religious movement with its new infallible leaders and its new infallible texts. Now, whether that's right or not is a very interesting question, but it is interesting to note how this question about celebrity status does seem to keep coming back. Those who criticize Dawkins, for example, are dubbed by his acolytes as being people who are publicity seekers. There seems to be no recognition that they might just be saying, look, we think this is wrong. Do you mind if we talk about it? No, to criticize Dawkins is somehow to try and crave the publicity that his name evokes. We see this, I think, in anxiety about numbers, which is a very revealing trend. And certainly if we look at North American sales figures for Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, the most recent I have, I'm afraid, is May of last year, they're just under 1 million copies, which of course is a good number, and that's very important. But atheist writers are aware that actually this is a big number, but it's not as big as it might be. And many of you will know, for example, that Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life, is a bestseller in America. It's a major religious book. And its sale figures in the same area are somewhat bigger. And actually, that corresponds quite well. I mean, the best statistics suggest that about 4% of the American population is atheist. So you can see that the sales figures are roughly, proportionally, what you might expect. So there is a question here. Yes, the numbers are big, but unfortunately, they're not as big as they might be. I personally wouldn't worry about this, but many atheist writers do, because it means that the movement is not having the cultural traction that they thought it might have. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. I want to look at a movement called the London Brights. Some of you will say, well, why are you doing this? Well, let's go back to Gary Wolfe. I mentioned him a moment ago. In his article announcing the arrival of a new atheism, he talked about the London Brights as being the biggest and best organized of the new atheist groups to arise recently. And I want to look at this movement because it does, I think, raise some very interesting questions. It was founded back in 2003, before the new atheism really got underway. It met occasionally, and then attendance soared in 2006 and 2007. The numbers went up, and the regularity of the meetings became much more frequent. I think there were meetings virtually every month during that period. And this, of course, coincides with the publication of Dawkins' God Delusion and Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. And the movement had its biggest attendance at a meeting that was filmed by Channel 4 television on this new phenomenon, the bright, that's another word for a secularist or an atheist, which is now, of course, part of British culture, or so Channel 4 said. So I thought it might be good just to look at this in a little more detail. And you can do this on your own. Look up London Brights on the internet. You'll be taken to their excellent website, which tells you about every single one of their meetings, what was discussed, a rating system between 1 and 5 stars as to how it was rated, the speaker, and the attendance. And in some cases, there are also photographs of the meeting, and you can try and count the number of people in it and add one for the photographer. And on the whole, I want to say the attendance figures are very accurate. So let's look at their smallest meeting. This was a meeting at which they decided they would watch the Da Vinci Code. Okay? You want to see the film, they said? Come and see it with a bunch of friendly atheists. Well, it was a very enticing invitation, but I'm afraid it wasn't really good enough because it drew a rather small attendance. However, of course, I want to emphasize this was a very small attendance. And so we're going to look now at the biggest meeting, which of course is with Channel 4 television there. The cameras were there, a chance to appear on television. And just to take us a bit further, they met monthly to begin with. There were only 2 meetings in 2009, none in 2010, and none since then. I checked this afternoon, there are no meetings. The internet comments on the last meeting of 2009 were words to this effect: if the organizer can't even bother turning up, why should we? Said the 9 people who came. So what I want to suggest to you is actually, this seems to suggest fading away. And I'm going to raise an issue with you, which is, if your movement is new, then maybe your attraction resides in your novelty value. And novelty is something that doesn't stay permanent. It fades. What was new once becomes old and loses its appeal. So I want to raise the question about whether there's a loss of novelty here, whether these ideas have become familiar and therefore in some way have lost it. P.Z. Myers is an atheist blogger. If there are any atheists here tonight, you've probably read him. He's quite sharp in his observations. And he is very, very clear that what is new about the new atheism is that whereas the old atheism, in his words, was very, very boring, the new atheism has brilliant slogans that capture the attention of the media and thus ensure its attention. For example, God is a delusion, a whole series of things like this, or Christopher Hitchens' 2 words, religion kills. Those are very easy to understand, and they make newspaper headlines. But of course, the real issue here is simply that while this is very, very good for ridicule and browbeating, the media loved it, at least to begin with, and then it began to fade away. And really the question I want to raise with you tonight is this: are we looking at a movement that has peaked in terms of its profile, or is it still there, perhaps in other forms? Clearly, it's an interesting question, and one that we would look at if we had more time. But of course, I've got to cover a lot of ground in this lecture, and therefore what I want to do is to try and look at some general themes. We've looked at the cultural context. Again, I want to emphasize how I welcome the new ease in talking about God. It is so easy today to talk about issues of faith or God compared with only 10 years ago. And I think also from a Christian perspective, we do realize now that churches simply weren't prepared for this outburst of atheism and the public reaction that followed. And I think that there's a lot that can be learned from that, particularly in terms of teaching people more about their faith. I mean, my private view, for what's worth, is that there's nothing in the new atheism, particularly in Dawkins or Hitchens, that need cause Christians any concern at all, providing they know something about their faith and can distinguish a caricature from the real thing. But I do worry about the quality of teaching in many Christian churches. And I think also we need to realize the debate has moved on. And indeed, in many ways now, we got beyond the God delusion stuff, and it's much more to do with the social function of religion and the issue of how we secure religious tolerance in a very complex society. But I think really you'd expect me to begin to engage with new atheism properly, and that's what I propose to do. And so I want to look at the core issues, and what I'm doing here is choosing what I think are the three best arguments that the new atheism puts forward. And these are what they are. First of all, that religion is dangerous. It poisons things. It poisons society. It poisons people's minds. Secondly, that belief in God is irrational and completely out of place in this modern world. And thirdly, that religion's been comprehensively discredited by science, which must ultimately triumph. Now, I've chosen these three because I think they are the best arguments, and I believe you must judge a movement by its best points, not its worst points, and therefore we're looking at these. I'm very happy to take this discussion more widely in the questions, but it seems to me these all merit close attention. Let's begin then with the first of these, which is that belief in God is damaging. You find this especially in Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, but you'll find it actually throughout the new atheist oeuvres. And I want to begin by saying I think Dawkins is right when he points out that religion has caused lots of problems like intolerance and violence. I think that's extremely important. When I was an atheist myself back in the late 1960s, part of the reason for this was that I was growing up in Northern Ireland. And okay, I've lost my accent, but I can still remember those days where it seemed to me obvious. Look, if there was no religion, there'd be no religious tensions, no religious violence. Get rid of religion, the world is a simpler and better place. I think that's the kind of thought that we find running through new atheism. And I want to say I think Dawkins needs to be, has made a good point here. We need to be very clear about that. Religion can cause lots of problems. But I want to add two qualifiers to that. In other words, I want to say let's get the full picture, not just a little bit of it. The full picture needs to be modified by two additional propositions. The first one, which Dawkins provides, is religion can be very damaging. But my second point is, but it need not. In other words, there are times when religion does some very good things. And certainly, many atheists are very, very uneasy about Dawkins because they say all he does is keep banging on about where religion goes wrong, and it's very hard to take that seriously when he doesn't give due recognition to things that religion does very, very well. And a good example would be Mother Teresa of Calcutta. So we need to tell the full story. Dawkins is very, very good at listing lots and lots of silly things and then portraying these as mainstream. But actually, it's not like that. And the full story does need to be told. Also, a very important point, the third point, which is that, yes, religion can cause lots of problems, but so did atheism when it came to power in the 20th century. Now, I'll talk about this a bit more. Dawkins and Hitchens are both very dismissive about this. If we look at the Soviet Union during the 1920s, 1930s, we see horrific violence used against religious institutions, religious buildings, and religious people. And it does not make for pleasant reading at all. And I think one of the things I'd want to say here is that maybe we just need to be aware that one of the things we need to be talking about is human nature itself. Maybe there's something wrong with us, which means that ideas that might, at one level, inspire us to do good things can also drag us down and make us do bad things. I think the Christian doctrine of original sin actually does cast a very helpful light on the way in which we are. So if I can just look at this in a little bit more detail, I think there is a real need to recognize that religion, belief in God, can provide a transcendent motivation for violence. That's a point that both Dawkins and Hitchens make. What they fail to realize is that if you were to abolish belief in God, then in effect the same thing would happen all over again because of this process, which I've called, I'm afraid in a very clumsy way, the transcendentalization of human values. In plain English, that just means taking an ordinary idea like freedom, democracy, and making that the end which justifies any means. In other words, we want to achieve this, and anything that gets in the way, we can sweep out of the way. And many of you will know the rather sad example of Madame Roland, executed in 1793 during the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution. And she was a supporter of the revolution who kind of found herself on the wrong side of a dividing line when things got really nasty. And as she was led to be guillotined, she pointed to a Statue of Liberty, rather similar, in fact, to the one that's now in the United States, and she spoke these words: "Liberty, what crimes are committed in your name?" And I think you can see exactly what she's saying. She's saying, look, liberty is wonderful, it's good, but look what these guys are doing with it. They are using it as an excuse to abuse. Their vision of liberty is driving them to eliminate, to wipe out those who disagree with them. And that's one of the reasons why the most vicious fights of the 20th century have been between ideologies. If you think of the Nazi-Soviet conflict, that's two ideologies locked at each other's throats with very different values which have both been transcendentalized, and as a result, it was absolute total war. I think we need to be aware of that. It's much more complex than they suggest. And of course, there is a very important point that needs to be made from a Christian perspective. And that is simply, where does Jesus come into this? Because as you will all know, the moral example of Jesus is central to any understanding of Christian ethics. This is the way Jesus behaved, therefore, this is the way we ought to behave as well. I don't want to sort of reduce Christian ethics to a slogan, but if I had to do it, what would Jesus do is a very good starting point. And of course, the key point is that Jesus didn't do violence. He kicked over a table in the temple, but on the whole, violence is something that was done to him, not by him. To illustrate the importance of this point, let's look at the Amish schoolhouse killings of October 2006. We're looking at a little village in Pennsylvania called Nickel Mines. An Amish community, you all know who the Amish are, a very conservative Protestant sect who wear 18th century dress, who drive horse buggies rather than cars. Very, very simple in many ways. A gunman who, according to a suicide note, was angry with God, broke into their schoolhouse and shot 10 schoolgirls, 5 of whom died. And it's a small community. They were traumatized. What would they do? Well, their moral code was very simple. We will act as Jesus did. What would Jesus do? He would forgive. And although it's painful, that's what they decided to do. And the media realized how significant this was because there was no retribution. The cycle of violence was broken before it ever really got off the ground. And the gunman's widow just thanked them for allowing her to begin her life all over again. Now, I'm sure there are good points that Dawkins and Hitchens are making, but I need to say to you, they are simply not giving you the full picture. And I think it's right to ask that the full story be told, not just a little bit that they like. So we move on, and I want to raise the question about atheist violence against religion. And we're looking especially at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was an atheist state. Dawkins seems to think it was somehow accidental it was atheist. But as those of you who've read Lenin's essay on religion will know, religion is counter-revolutionary. It is something that must be eliminated for the good of the revolution. And so we find a series of deeply repressive measures. Why? Because God wouldn't go away. One of the things that is known to have angered Stalin enormously was the realization that about 65% of the Soviet population still actively believed in God by the late 1930s. So a series of measures were introduced to make theory conform with reality. And it wasn't really very nice. And even in the 1950s under Khrushchev, who was much nicer than Stalin, you had aggressively atheist educational programs in Soviet schools. And these had rather neat little slogans. Here's one of them. Religion has become the medium for the spiritual enslavement of the masses. And you know, one of the things I find is, as I read both Dawkins and Hitchens, I find similarly breezy little slogans, which I think they'd have loved back in the Soviet Union during the 1950s. But Dawkins is very clear on one point. He says, no atheist I know would dream of dynamiting Mecca or Chartres or York Minster or anything like that. Atheists just don't do that sort of things. Well, maybe the ones he knows don't. But in the real world, outside the ivory towers of Oxford, things do look rather different. This is the very famous, I would say infamous case of the dynamiting of the university church in Leipzig in 1968. This church, built in 1240, was an architectural masterpiece, but it was in a square in Leipzig in East Germany. Remember East Germany, German Democratic Republic, officially atheist, which was called the Karl Marx-Platz. In other words, having a massive symbol of religious history in the midst of this Marxist square was a bit of an embarrassment. So in 1968, well, that's what they do. They blew it up with dynamite. I think it's just a reminder that actually, you know, this incredibly naive picture of atheism as simply good and gentle and gracious. I'm sure it's true of many atheists, but it's not true of all. And what I would simply say to the new atheism is, look, you know, you generalize crassly about people who believe in God. You need to realize that your own situation needs closer examination as well. So is religion a bad thing? Well, certainly one of the points we need to ask here is how you'd work out whether religion is good or bad. Dawkins, I think, is quite clear about one thing, and that is that science has no methods for deciding what is ethical. That's a very important point. I think he's absolutely right. It's a very important indication of the limits of science. There are areas where really, there are certain things that just can't really say. So what I want to ask is, how might we determine that religion is bad for you empirically? Because there is a vast literature. And those of you who know this literature and also have read the works of New Atheism will be puzzled by the fact that it's not quoted. Why, I wonder? Well, those of you who know literature will be aware of massive work in this field. The work that still, I think, dominates the field is now 10 years old. And Koenig and Cohen's book, The Link Between Religion and Health. And subsequent research, I think, has basically reinforced what these guys said. So let's look at what they said. What they did was to look at 100 empirical research studies of the impact of religious commitment on individuals. And what I don't mean is 100 individuals, what I mean is 100 individual published studies on the impact of religious commitment on well-being defined by a number of parameters, including longevity and morbidity. This is what they found. They found that 79 of them reported at least one positive correlation between religious involvement and well-being. Then there were 20 which either found no pattern or a mixed pattern, a little bit good, a little bit bad, nothing overall. And one of them found a negative association between religion and well-being. Now, this research continues, and this is the pattern that continues to emerge. If Dawkins and Hitchens were right, and religion is psychologically damaging, then these figures should be the other way up. We should be looking at a massive finding that religious commitment produces psychologically and socially damaged people. Now, we all know there are some forms of religion that do damage to people. Everybody knows that. But what about the mainstream? You've got to look at that. And this is the kind of result that comes out of that. So I do need to suggest it's not quite as straightforward as these guys are suggesting. So we come to our second major theme, which is the irrationality of faith. It's a major theme for Dawkins, less so for Hitchens, but certainly for Dawkins, this is the big deal. And Dawkins argues that faith in God is childish. In my own case, I certainly believed in Santa Claus when I was very small. I think I stopped believing in Santa Claus when I was about 4. But I have to be very honest with you and say I didn't bother telling my parents of this development. Because I realized there were certain fringe benefits linked with this, which I wanted to keep going. When I was 18, I discovered belief in God. And in the eyes of the British law, 18 is adulthood. And certainly, all the psychological research suggests that actually it's when people grow up that they begin to discover faith in God for what it really is. So I want to raise a question mark about the reliability of this. It's a polemical argument, which is saying, look, here are childish beliefs, and therefore belief in God's one of them. It's clear they are in different categories altogether. But moving on, I think there's a much more powerful point that needs to be looked at very closely. I'm going to just give you some points made by Isaiah Berlin, very famous Oxford philosopher and historian of ideas. And he simply argued that as he looked at both contemporary culture and intellectual history, he saw 3 kinds of beliefs. First of all, those that can be established by empirical observation. In other words, something you can confirm by looking at the world. Secondly, those that can be established by logical deduction. 2 and 2 make 4, for example. And then a lot, those that cannot be proved in either of those ways. And Berlin simply made this point. Everything that really matters to us belongs to that third category. Let me give you some examples. These are all things that will belong to Berlin's third category. Democracy is better than fascism. We should care for widows and orphans. Rape is wrong. And the list could go on. And these are things I all believe myself. If you were to say to me, prove those, I couldn't. But they seem to me to be right, and they profoundly affect the way in which I behave and live my life. I want to suggest to you that all of us here tonight have certain core beliefs that govern who we are as people, that affect deeply our values, the way in which we act, and we know we can't prove them. And one of the curious things is that New Atheism seems to demand almost like a standard of justification, which it demands of others, but doesn't apply to its own beliefs. For example, Christopher Hitchens in God is Not Great says our belief is no belief. In other words, we don't believe anything, we just take what's right. But those who've read his book will know it's nothing like that at all. There are moral values deeply embedded in his analysis, and they are values that cannot be proved, but they are values he believes to be right. And the simple point is that faith is just a fact of life. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's just the way things are. There's Terry Eagleton, one of the most perceptive critics of Dawkins, who says we hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain. Or, if I might quote a woman philosopher, I'm sorry I've been a bit light on women tonight, Julia Kristeva, whether I belong to a religion, whether I be agnostic or atheist, when I say I believe, I mean I hold as true. And the point she's making is, look, there are lots of things we hold as true that we can't prove to be true. But we nevertheless think it's reasonable to believe this, because although it's not absolutely proven, it seems a pretty good bet all the same. So I think there are real problems here for Dawkins, not for me. Basically, religious faith is not irrational. It just goes beyond the limits of reason. And one of the points that Isaiah Berlin makes about the 20th century is that the critique of pure reason that we find in the 20th century is not about an outbreak of irrationality, it's about a protest against people who demand that we limit ourselves to what reason can prove. Because Berlin's point is that is a very narrow little world which has little relevance to the real world in which we have to think big thoughts and make big decisions. And we could go on like this. For example, going back to the 13th century, Dante's very famous statement that reason has short wings. And of course, when it comes to belief in God, very often people talk about demanding proof that there is a God, but I think there are other approaches that need to be brought into the scheme here, and these include approaches which are more based on inference than deduction. And C.S. Lewis here is giving us one. He's saying, look, in many ways you judge a theory by the amount of sense it makes of things. If this were right, it would make sense of things. It seems it does. I believe in Christianity, he writes, as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. That's the final sentence of his essay, Is Theology Poetry? And it's all about the idea of empirical fit. Well, here is theory, here is observation. How good is the fit between them? And if there is a good fit, it's an indication that the theory is right. So we're looking for the best picture, the big picture, trying to ask what a theory of things actually makes sense of things. And this isn't about proof, in that very often you just can't do this. It's rather saying, look, it seems to us this way of thinking makes the best sense of the evidence. For example, think of a trial where the clues and evidence are all laid out. The prosecution and defense will offer different explanations of that evidence. And the jury is asked which of those theories seem to fit the evidence best. And you all know the point the judge will make to the jury. It's not, have you proved this? It's rather, which is thought to be true beyond reasonable doubt. In other words, a realization that with big things like this, you can't absolutely prove, but you nonetheless make judgments about what is right and what is wrong. Here's Richard Dawkins. Universe we observe, it begins by looking at things, has precisely the properties you should expect. If there is a bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, he's saying, look, there's a match, in my view, between what I observe and what I believe. I think there is no purpose, no good, no evil. I look at the universe, and that seems to chime in with what I think. And against that, we can put Lewis's view, which is basically that he became a Christian because in his view, the Christian faith made more sense of the scientific enterprise, human history, his own experiences, and what he saw around him than anything else. This debate is still open. It's not closed down. And we might say that there are three ways we might look at this. A map. How well does it correspond to the observed landscape? Christianity is offering you a map and inviting you to ask, how good is the correspondence? Or again, think of the Christian faith as being like a lens. How well does it bring things into focus? Or a light. How well does it illuminate the landscape? And to end this section is Simone Weil, as you probably know, a Jewish atheist who became a Christian as a result of her reading, and basically using this analogy to help us think this through. If I light an electric torch at night out of doors, I don't judge its power by looking at the bulb, but by seeing how many objects it lights up. The value of a religious way of life is appreciated by the amount of illumination thrown on the things of this world. So I come to the final point. Does science disprove God? And as I think you all know, this is a major theme in the New Atheism, particularly Richard Dawkins, who argues here in Selfish Gene, published in 1976, that basically faith is completely dispelled by science. Science is about proving, faith is just about running away from the evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, he says, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. It's very simple, but I fear it's clearly wrong. Let me give you an example simply to make this point very, very clearly. There's a huge debate going on in modern cosmology. Is there just one universe, or is there a bubble, a sort of raft of universes called a multiverse? And as some of you here tonight will be aware, the evidence is profoundly ambivalent, and the jury's out. But that doesn't stop scientists saying, we think this is right, or we think this is right. In other words, they are doing precisely what Dawkins says they should not do, because the evidence isn't good enough to compel you to take either of these positions. It's suggestive and leaves you to make the judgment. And what I do not find is those scientists who say there is a multiverse turning to those who think there's simply a universe and say, you are fools, you are mad, you're deluded, because they're aware of the complexity of the interpretative task. And the point I simply want to make is that really this very simplistic idea, science is about proof, religion is about running away from evidence, just doesn't really stand up. Again, if I have time, I talk about Charles Darwin, who was very, very clear that his new theory of natural selection was open to massive criticism. And this is what he writes towards the end of The Origin of Species. He's just saying, look, there are lots of problems with this, I know that, but I still think this is right, even though there are lots of problems. To the best of my judgment, the greater number of these difficulties are only apparent, and those that are real are not, I think, fatal to my theory. In other words, Darwin was very much aware. He believed his theory to be right, but he knew he couldn't prove it. And in many ways, that's where we are in belief in God. When I stopped being an atheist and became a Christian, I was absolutely clear in my own mind, this is the best way of seeing things that really makes sense. I can't absolutely prove it, just as I couldn't prove my earlier atheism. But this seems to make more sense than anything else, and if it's right, it changes everything. Going back to this question, this is Stephen Jay Gould, many of you will know of him, died recently from lung cancer, an atheist, but one who was very, very clear he was not an atheist because of his science, because it lay beyond the scope of the scientific method. Science simply cannot, by its legitimate methods, adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm it nor deny it. We simply can't comment on it as scientists. The point he's simply making is there are limits to the scientific method, and that's why science has gained such credibility by limiting itself to things it can comment on and steering clear of those which lie beyond its scope. I concede that Dawkins talks a lot about God, but maybe he does so as an atheist rather than as a scientist. And there are other points we could make. Very briefly, one of them is that there are limits to science. We saw this earlier when Dawkins makes the point very, very clearly, and in my view, absolutely rightly, that science has no methods for telling us what is right and what is wrong. And I'm sure all of you here tonight would say, well, actually, it is rather important to work out what is right and what is wrong, and I'd certainly be with you on that. And I would not dream of criticizing science for not being able to tell us what's right and wrong, because science is science. It works because of what it is, and it's unfair to say, let's apply it to here, because it just is being distorted if you do. And therefore, there are going to be lots of questions which lie beyond the scope of science, which remain real questions and important questions and valid questions, which you and I want to answer. And if science can't answer them, we say, well, let's look for answers somewhere else. Dawkins, I think, does make some very important points here. I think he is saying we need to ask very carefully what reasons can be given for believing things. But I think he goes beyond that himself. Bertrand Russell, an earlier generation of atheists, would simply say science is the only thing that can tell us what's right, what's wrong. But most recent scientists are very cautious about this. There's Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine for his work on immunobiology, in a late work called The Limits of Science. He says, look, the existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer, well, questions like this. Look at them. What are we all here for? What's the point of life? And Meadower is simply saying these are real and important questions. It's not that there are no answers. It's not that we are wrong to look for answers or believe we found them. It's just that science can't answer them. What I want to say to you is that's no criticism of science. It's simply saying that's the way things are. Let's adjust to it. And final point to make is a really very simple point. That is that science keeps changing its mind. If we had been in this church, because it's a very old church, 100 years ago, and we were talking about the origins of the universe, we wouldn't be talking about the origins of the universe because people believed the universe had always been there. That was the consensus of the 1910s. Today, a century later, we believe it came into existence. And of course, it's a very important point. And we could talk about this a lot. People like Fred Hoyle were very resistant to this because they thought it sounded rather too religious to say the universe came into being from nothing. It's a very good example of anti-religious sentiment holding back progress in science. But an interesting point is this. In 1948, there was a very famous debate here in London on BBC Radio 3 between Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston on the question of God. A big debate, lots of ground. Copleston won the debate about whether we need God to have morality, but Russell won the part of the debate about whether we needed God to explain the universe, because Russell said, it's always been there. You don't need God to explain that. When this debate was replayed 50 years later, this time with William Lane Craig and Anthony Flew found himself in extreme difficulty over this business about the universe coming into being from nothing. And as you probably know, subsequently Flew began to rethink, and at the time of his death, he wasn't a Christian, but he believed in some kind of God out there, and this was part of his reasoning for doing so. So lots to think about there, but it's time for me to wrap up because you've been extremely patient and you need a comfort break. But I cannot end this discussion without talking about that question. It's very clear God isn't going to go away unless you force him out by socially repressive means. That's really where we are. But there are deeper issues, and that is that the Christian vision of humanity is that we have a homing instinct from God, which is planted by God, and which eventually will lead us back to him if we let it. There's a Renaissance poet, Francis Quarles, who you probably haven't heard of, but he's worth reading. Our soul is like, I quote, an iron needle drawn to the magnetic pole of God. He's reworking a theme we find in Ecclesiasticus chapter 3. You have planted eternity in our hearts. And really the Christian vision of human nature is simply this. Yes, we're messed up. Yes, there are all kinds of problems. But there is something about the way we are made, which means we are meant to find our way back to God, just like the iron needle is drawn to the magnetic pole of God. To end with that very famous prayer from Augustine of Hippo back about the year 402. Again, it's a prayer, you have made us for ourselves, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. In the end, the Christian is very, very grateful to people like Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett for trying to puzzle out, why it is that we are drawn to God in this way. But it's an integral part of this Christian understanding of human nature. However it came about, we're made with this capacity, this inner tendency to find our way back towards God, just like the prodigal son found his way back home. And that, for me, is one of the reasons why God is never going to go away, because we are creatures who are constantly questing for meaning, for significance, for dignity, and are wondering what things are all about. And if C.S. Lewis were here tonight, he would simply make the point that that deep sense of longing is really a disguised longing for a God who surprises us with his joy. Much more needs to be said, but that's enough for the time being. Thank you so much for being such a kind and attentive audience. My question, in case those of you who are away from the hall didn't hear it, is basically what sort of things should the churches be doing in response to this? And I think that there are many things. I think that very often, and this goes back to a very interesting situation at Oxford, which led to the formation of the Socratic Club, which C.S. Lewis chaired. And as you may know, this was formed by students who said, look, these preachers tell us what to think, but they don't tell us why we should believe this. And really the Socratic Club was all about the reasons for faith. And I think that's part of the answer, that Christians need to know why they believe certain things, how best to make sense of them and explain them, and then if this is true, what difference does it make? And very often churches are quite good at saying, this is what we Christians believe, and that's better than nothing. But actually, I mean, congregations are intelligent people. They need to be helped to understand why they believe this. What are the reasons for it? And Richard Dawkins is entirely right to say, why do you believe that? And if Christians don't know, they haven't been well taught, and they deserve to be. And I just feel that many pastors let their congregations down, I'm afraid. So I think there's just a wake-up call here. And actually, I'm very encouraged by what's happened since then, because I know many churches are laying on courses that are quite good in doing this kind of thing. There's a lot more I need to say, but that's the main thing I'd like to say. Thank you very much. Let's keep going. I think that's a very good question. In what way does science look these days through postmodern lenses, and how does that play into this whole God question we've been talking about tonight? And certainly Dawkins would argue that science is really opposed to postmodernity, because postmodernity is very flexible, it's open, it recognizes multiple perspectives, whereas science is about it's either A or B, it's not both. And therefore science is aiming for a precision that postmodernity seems to think is unattainable. And I'm with Dawkins to some extent on this. I think science in many ways is about saying, look, we've got to find out what reality is really like, and we can't just say all perspectives are equally good, because we've got to try and work out what's what. And therefore trying to sort out the way things really are is very important. And therefore in one sense science is critical of postmodernity. But I'm with Dawkins on this, and I'm with him for two reasons. Number one, because I think that's what science is actually doing. And number two, because one of the things that brought me to faith was science, because it forced me to say, what is the best way of making sense of this world? And, you know, I looked at things from an atheist perspective, looking from a Christian perspective, and the Christian way of looking just seemed so much better. It explains so much more. And so I really welcome this demand that we look at things closely and investigate them. But postmodernity, I think, would want to say one thing in response to Dawkins, which I think is a good point, and we need to be aware of it. And that is, maybe reality is just more complex than we can fit into our theories. I think one of the things a number of postmodern writers make is that there is a danger that we will think that science offers a total account of reality. That was the point I was trying to make with this limits of science business. And I think that if I can put it like this, science tries to bring things into focus as much as it can, but if reality is a bit fuzzy at points, you know, no amount of tinkering with the lens is going to make it any sharper. So I think there's a need just to realize that there are some things that actually may be much more open-ended than we would like. Not more to be said, but that's just a good way of dealing with that. Thank you. How do I think that divisions within denominations play into the new atheist agenda? Again, it's a very good question. I think that there's nothing wrong with Christians disagreeing with each other. They do. I'm sure if you and I would have a long conversation, we'd identify at least 25 points at which we disagreed. But that doesn't mean we have to fight. You know, why should a perfectly good disagreement become a fight? And I think that the real difficulty is that I think very often Christians are a little ungracious towards each other. And very often we do need to recognize that actually we can talk about these things. What I think the new atheists are saying is that when you put two Christians together in a room, there will be a violent fight. and that is a paradigm for the problem that religion causes. Religions fight each other and cause violence. They fight secularists, and that causes even more violence. For example, Christopher Hitchens, you may remember, towards the beginning of his book, God is Not Great, says, religious people are out to get us, out to destroy us. That's very direct. Many would say it's an overstatement, but you can see what he's getting at. So what I'd want to say is that in relation to new atheism, it's not just arguments that matter, it's behavior. And actually, well-behaved Christians are quite a good argument against atheism, but very often we don't behave quite as well as we should. Thank you. The question is basically, could I give some theological reasons for suggesting why faith is needed in the first place? I mean, could not things be more obvious? I think it's a very good point, and it opens up many interesting lines of discussion. I think the first point I'd want to make, which I think rises very naturally from what you're saying, is that I think new atheists are quite right to say, look, we need to work out what we can be absolutely sure about. I think that's a very fair point. But I'm not quite so sure that they're agreed on what that is. I notice a very significant debate between new atheists, for example. To give you one example about this, Sam Harris, for example, in effect says, well, atheism is right, but it's existentially deficient. It doesn't satisfy, it may satisfy the mind, but it doesn't satisfy the deeper longings of the human soul, which is why he's into Eastern mysticism. So there, I think you have somebody saying, well, look, it might be right, but it's not good enough. You have to supplement it with something else. So that, I think, is a very interesting point. But I think that one of the main points here is that from a Christian perspective, human nature is finite. There are limits to what we can do. Our eyesight isn't as good as it should be. We're walking in the dark, so to speak, to use a whole series of New Testament images. And that very often means we need help to see things as they really are. One of the reasons that the New Testament uses the image of the healing of those who are blind is to try and get across the idea that actually our own sight isn't as good as we think it is. And we think we see clearly, but in fact we see a very limited thing. We see on the surface, not beneath the depths. And therefore there is more to life than what we see. And in many ways, what I think the controversy between the new atheists and Christians is, I mean, obviously there's many components, but one of them is this. The new atheism really is saying, what you see is what you get. Go back to that quote from Dawkins I gave you. The universe we observe has precisely the properties you should expect. If there is a bottom, no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, what you see, that's it. The Christian says, look, when you go deeper, beneath the surface, you begin to realize it's not that simple. And for the Christian idea of revelation is not so much about contradicting reason. It's about saying, look, it only goes thus far. We need to go much deeper. And once you see that, everything looks different. That's the point Lewis makes in his Pilgrim's Regress. When the pilgrim discovers God and walks back, everything looks different, even though he's seeing the same things before, but he's seeing them in a new way. So I think there's this idea of, limits to what to our reasoning, to our seeing, but above all, this need to go deeper rather than just resting content with what's there on the surface. New atheism is more critical of religion than Christianity. That's absolutely true, and in particular, the tribalism it generates. So what might Christians say in response to other faiths? Well, I think the first point to make is that there is an issue here. I think that one of the big difficulties that I think modern theories of religion encounter is there isn't a universally accepted theory of what a religion is. So we need to be careful about using the word religion because, for example, if you compare Christianity and Confucianism, and Confucianism is really a philosophy of life, which we've categorized as a religion, but I think it really is. So we need to be a little bit careful there. But I think that what I would encourage is what I see in the New Testament, especially in the Acts of the Apostles. Because what you need to remember is that in the New Testament, Christianity is expanding into a religiously plural world. In other words, there are loads of other faith systems, belief systems, sacred and secular there in the Roman Empire of the first century. And Christians are having to work out how to engage with these. And if you read, for example, the first letter to Peter, which actually almost presupposes that they are engaged in these difficult conversations, they're occasionally leading to real difficulties, the constant advice is to be gracious. To be peaceable, to have a good reputation publicly, to conduct yourself well. So I think that is something we do need to bear in mind. My personal take on this is that I must try and mirror in my attitude towards everyone the graciousness that I see in Scripture, but above all in Jesus Christ. And therefore, even when for example, I'm dialoguing with an atheist or a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever, I must treat them with respect because this is someone who God made, even though I disagree with them. And I think that the important thing is to try and mirror in my demeanor and interaction the way I believe God to be. And yes, I do believe Christianity is right, and therefore, not in an arrogant way, but rather this is what I found to be true and believed to be right and believed to be important, so I long to share it. But very often I think I have to realize that it's a gracious, winsome discussion rather than a dismissive, sweeping rejection that's going to win a debate. But that actually has implications for the new atheism. I mean, I don't know if there are any new atheists here tonight, but one thing I would say to you is, you need to find better representatives than what you find in Dawkins and Hitchens, because they simply convey the impression that atheism is dismissive, intolerant, and arrogant. And that's not the message I'd have thought you want to get out. Thank you. How can Christians best deal with the anti-Christian bias we see in the media? Well, I think we need to be careful about this. I don't think the media is that biased. I think that the media has its own way of seeing things, and very often it does find Christianity a little bit difficult to make sense of. And I think that there are lots of stereotypes out there of what religious people are like, and I'm sure I've probably reinforced a lot of them tonight. But I think one thing I'd want to say is that it's perfectly reasonable to ask that Christian voices be welcomed in the media. That is to say that we don't have people sort of saying, well, of course, here is an atheist perspective on Christianity, but rather allow Christians to be able to talk about this. And I think that one of the main things I would want to say in this context is that, if people listening to this as Christians feel they are being misrepresented or victimized in any way, you have a perfect right to protest. And actually, that's something maybe you should do. But I think the main thing I'd want to say to you is that many Christians, because they feel the way that we see in that question, have kind of way disengaged from the media. And I would really say I think the media might be enriched if Christians were to feel they could get more actively engaged. There are very important debates about the limits of faithful engagement in the public arena, but I do not see why Christians should not get involved in this. Not least because it corrects very misleading understandings. I mean, very often I read the newspapers, and I remember seeing, I think it was an Independent, a newspaper headline about a reverend does this, and I thought they don't even know the word for a Church of England clergyman, And I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done. Maybe if Christians could get into the media more, they might be able to both help correct unhelpful perspectives, but also boost the understanding of what Christianity is. I think one of the things the new atheism has really brought out very clearly is that there's actually quite a low public understanding of what Christianity is. I think one of the reasons why, for example, Richard Dawkins' rather puzzling stereotypes of Christianity, which bear little relation to the real thing, have been accepted, is an awful lot of people just don't really understand anymore what Christianity is. And in my view, one of the best defenses of Christianity is simply to explain what it really is. Thank you. Question. Do I think that the new atheism is a largely Western thing? I think it is. Now, if we had a sociologist here, there are going to be lots of PhD theses written on the new atheism. And the topics they will investigate will include the following fact. The leading representatives of the new atheism, I've mentioned them, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, are all white, middle class, male, and you go on like that. In other words, they are in a sociological niche. What does that say about the movement? I think it's an extremely interesting point. Certainly, I remember once giving a talk on new atheism to a very mixed audience, and it was roughly half female, half male, and all the questions afterwards, mainly atheist audience, were very aggressive questions from the males. Afterwards, some of the women come to me and said, you know, we just don't think like that. I mean, they're so dogmatic. I mean, you may be wrong, but actually, we can see it's much more complicated than they think. And I thought, well, there's another PhD thesis waiting to be written. But Africa is really interesting. There is one African nation in which there is a reasonable number of atheists in South Africa, and they're mostly white. Now, what's that saying? I talked about this once with some African bishops who I met, mainly from sort of Kenya, Uganda, that sort of area there. And they were saying, look, you know, for us, God is just such a living reality. This atheism stuff doesn't make any sense. It only starts to make sense when you Westerners start to make religion all about ideas, and it ceases being about something that's living and relational and exciting. I felt I had to go away rather chastened from that discussion. So I think that you're right. There's something there that needs to be looked at. It is very much a Western phenomenon. But as I said, I know already the theses are being written, and when they're published, it'll be very interesting, because I think that actually sociologically, it does occupy a very interesting and distinct niche. Thank you. The question was just saying, look, you talked a lot about people like C.S. Lewis, who are very good on the rationality of faith, but what about people like Kierkegaard or Tertullian, who perhaps emphasize that perhaps faith is slightly more irrational than that? And I think I know what you mean. I mean, certainly if you take Tertullian, I mean, one of the points he makes is, look, Christians believe in ideas which are so countercultural that, you know, who's going to believe that? Because it's so way off the center of culture. And therefore he's saying, look, the fact people believe this is an indication that actually there's something about these ideas which doesn't make them culturally plausible, but makes them profoundly intellectually plausible. Now, I personally think that Lewis does make some good points, for example, in Mere Christianity, but that book is 60 years old. And, you know, we really have moved on a bit since then. And certainly we'd have to revise some of Lewis's ideas in the light of, for example, the move towards postmodernity. But I think he does make some good points, which is, you know, the world is studded with clues. And the question is, what's the big picture that makes most sense of those clues? But in the end, I think, here's what I think we need to say. I personally believe Christianity makes an awful lot of sense of an awful lot of things, but doesn't prove absolutely, as I can prove to you that 2 and 2 makes 4. And so there is a sense in which, you know, in committing myself to this, I am making what Kierkegaard calls a leap of faith. But it's not a leap of faith into the unknown. It's sort of a leap of faith saying, I can't absolutely prove it, but it looks so right and so good, I'm going to say, I accept this, even though I know I can't absolutely prove it. To use language which I think does justice to Kierkegaard, it's saying you can commit yourself existentially to something without being absolutely cognitively certain it's right. In other words, to give another example, I mean, most politicians I know are conviction politicians, and that's not universal, I just happen to know the right ones. And they will say, look, you know, it's all about, and they will talk about the moral, the social ideals that drive them. But when you press them, they can't prove them. And they know that, but they still say, look, these are right, and we've committed ourselves to them, and we're going to try and actualize those. And actually, there is a parallel. And that's why Kierkegaard is making a good point, which is we need to respect the limits of reason. You can't live life on the basis of what reason proves. To be an authentic human being, you've just got to go beyond the very severe limits of reason, and that doesn't make you irrational. That's a new atheist idea. It means, in effect, you recognize the limits of reason and say, look, I can't prove it, but beyond there, over that hill, there is something. It makes sense. I'm going to embrace it. More needs to be said. That's just a sketch map of what I'd say. Thank you. The questioner was just making the point that perhaps the shrillness of new atheism has made the atheism of indifference seem rather more attractive. And what do we take that? That's, I think, a very interesting point. I have many friends who I think would self-define as atheists, but when they do so, they very often self-define like this. I'm an atheist, but not like Richard Dawkins. In other words, they're trying to say, look, there is this atheism and that atheism, and it's not that. You know, it's almost as if there's a real embarrassment about this. And I think it's very interesting because there is, I think, a growing realization about this. I had a letter from a senior humanist today just taking issue with me about some points I'd made in the book, but then saying, look, the real problem is that we humanists have got such a bad reputation because we're so arrogant and dogmatic, and we deserve that. I think that is, an important point to bear in mind. In engaging the new atheism, that's one kind of atheism, but most atheists aren't like that. Most atheists will say to me, look, we respect you, we're so glad you believe in God, we don't, but that's our belief system, that's your belief system, where can we go on this? And I think that the point I'd want to make is we can have some very good conversations about this. And with many atheists who are not committed but are not believers, in other words, who are in this sort of uncommitted area, one of the reasons they're uncommitted is that they feel that if they were to start getting interested in this, they might end up becoming dogmatic or something like that. That's one of the reasons why they're not new atheists, because they see that happening to people who buy into that. And therefore, I think one of the things we do need to do is think very hard about how we can get across one of the central themes of Christianity, which is that it is transformative. It brings a new dimension to life. It's all about restoration, forgiveness, a new sense of identity and purpose, which can go wrong. But when it goes right, it's life-changing. I think it's trying to explain that and trying even harder to model that, which really can be very significant. Because certainly one of the things that seems to emerge from reflections on why people do come to faith, particularly later in life, is that very often it's not so much reflection on Christian ideas, it's by watching certain Christians they respect and how they behave. And in effect saying that that guy has something I don't, and I wonder what it is. So I would certainly say, that dialoguing with what we've called atheists of indifference doesn't mean that they are indifferent to these questions. In many ways, sometimes they're slightly fearful to open the box because they think it could lead to some very dangerous outcomes. And I think one of the questions we have to ask is how we help people to begin to explore those questions, helping them to move along at whatever speed they feel is appropriate. And that actually very often is a judgment we have to make based on our friendships with people and how we feel things are moving along. Thank you. It's a very good question, and certainly if we look at the Old Testament, when it talks about faith, it's not really belief that, although that's implied. The real issue is trust. When the Old Testament talks about the true God, it doesn't mean God truly exists. It means here is a God who may be trusted. This is the real deal. I think that is very important because it immediately allows you to say, look, whatever else faith is, and I'm sure there's more that needs to be said, it is about trusting this God. God is our shepherd who leads us through the wilderness of this world and is always with us, even when we pass through the valley of the shadow of death. And for me, I'm someone who engages in New Atheism quite a lot, and I'm very much aware that in dealing with the New Atheists' representation of faith simply as beliefs, actually I'm reinforcing that by engaging with it, because I'm not really able to say, well, of course, there's more to faith than that. It's about relationships, about transformation, because if the point of debate is Christian faith rational, then I've kind of got to engage with that question, and very often it means I can't say everything I'd want to about the nature of faith. But going back to your first point, again, I very much appreciate the point you've made. If I go back to C.S. Lewis, simply because he's very accessible, I think a very good writer, he will say that perhaps on our own we can really begin to develop the sense there's more to life than we know, that there's something beyond that hill, and you have some very deep intuitions about it. And then when God surprises you, he surprises you in coming to you when you thought you had to come to him. But he doesn't surprise you in another sense, in that you begin to realize that the deepest intuitions of your heart actually are pointing you in the right direction. And that's why Lewis talks so much about the heart's desire. And I think that's very, very important. Again, if you think of a great work of medieval literature, Dante's Divine Comedy, for part of the journey, Dante is accompanied by Virgil. Then Virgil is basically a symbol of reason. Then there comes a point in the journey where Virgil says, right, you know, I'm sorry, this is as far as I go, but there is more of the road to travel, and actually it keeps going in this direction. So, you know, I stop here, but you don't. And I think that is important. People very often say Christianity is irrational. And when you begin to unpack that, very often it's that it's going beyond what reason can prove. But the point Isaiah Berlin makes so powerfully in his writings is actually there are so many people who are simply imprisoned by a very shallow notion of reason, which fences you in a very dogmatic little compound, and then all around it is something much richer, which it forbids you to discover. And in many ways, faith is simply saying, I'm going there, I'm going to discover this. I think that's a very important point to make. It's liberating, not irrational, except in that it says reason itself has its limits, but they're limits that are meant to be transgressed. Thank you. I think that there is a real problem in explaining Christian imagery in a secular culture. I mean, I'm a great lover of old hymns, and you probably know the one which talks about being washed in the blood of the Lamb. Beautiful hymn in many ways, but when particularly younger people, or when a secular audience look at that, they think, what is this? You know, it really seems, well, possibly just puzzling, but to many it will seem actually quite repulsive. I don't really like the sound of that very much. And I think this really, brings home to us that we've got a lot of translating and explaining to do. And, you know, the New Testament uses a rich range of imagery to talk about the meaning of Christ's death. And certainly, particularly to the Hebrews, you know, the idea that Christ is the fulfillment of the sacrificial system. In other words, he brings it to completion so it never needs to be done again. You know, is a very, very powerful theme, and it actually offers, I think, a lot of insights. But it is quite difficult to explain, partly because the word sacrifice nowadays in British culture either means I sacrificed my lunch break to see a student, or it has very, very negative associations with weird cults. And one's unhelpful, the other is really disastrous for us, I think. And so we really do need to do, I wouldn't say moving away from what the New Testament says at all. I think there's no problem there. I think that the issue really is we've got to explain it a lot better. And that means trying to work out analogies which might help the meaning to be made more clear to a culture which actually finds this really quite difficult to understand. So you're absolutely right, we've got a lot of thinking to do, but I think it's really about how we communicate, how we translate these ideas to try and help people understand better what they are. And again, one of the very first questions we had was about, you know, Christian education, and I think that very often we're quite good at making sure people say the right words, but actually don't help them to unpack them, and above all to be able to restate them for people who don't know the jargon at all. I think that's a very important thing for us to do, and I think we need to do it a bit better. Thank you. The questioner is explaining at the moment he's an atheist, and actually in some ways we're kind of on different journeys, but at what point do you make up your mind? How much thinking do you need to do? I think that's a very good question. In my own case, I mean, the thing that really began to make me think I've got some serious rethinking to do happened after I'd done my Oxford entrance exams. And this is going back a very long time. In those days, you did 2 years in the sixth form, and then scholarship exams were in the first term of a third sixth form year. And I got into Oxford to do chemistry. And most of my friends spent the rest of that year traveling the world. I'm a thoroughly boring person. I thought I'm going to read everything in the school library. And it tells you a lot, doesn't it? And there was this section called The History and Philosophy of Science. It was very small, and most of the books were quite old, from the sort of late 40s, early 50s. But I read them all. And actually, by the end of that, I thought, things are a bit more complicated than I thought. I began to realize, some of the things I was talking about tonight, that science may say there are good reasons for thinking this, but we're not absolutely sure. It was an eye-opener because I'd bought into this very naive scientific positivism. Science proves things, which actually, it's an aspiration, but very often it's not an aspiration that's achieved. And it didn't make me believe in God. I want to make that very, very clear. But it planted the seeds of doubt in my mind. And above all, it planted this seed of doubt. Maybe you can trust something even though you can't prove it. Now, that's just a simple little thought. And it didn't convert me. But it did it was like the thin end of a wedge, which made me think, perhaps I've been a bit simplistic about this. Perhaps there's more to this than meets this. And so when I went to Oxford, I thought, right, let's have a really good go at this. And I argued and talked and gradually began to realize actually maybe cognitively things were rather different. And also beginning to appreciate the more existential and relational side. Because I think when I was younger, I'd formed the view that Christianity was basically, you're not allowed to do these things, but you must do these things. The things you weren't allowed to do seemed rather interesting. And the ones you were made to do seemed just a little bit dull. And actually, I just couldn't see for the life of me why anybody would want to do that sort of stuff. And I think it was really beginning to discover the more existential and relational side of things, which happened, I think, alongside a growing realization, actually, maybe this does make a lot of sense of things. But it wasn't just making sense. It was also this deeper side. So I think the paradox is that I don't really understand what happened. But I do know I began to think about a lot of things, and then things just began to fall into place. And obviously, I've moved on a bit since then. I've thought some deeper, but not necessarily better thoughts, and I've grown in my Christian life. So in fact, although I've never lost sight of the ability of Christianity to make sense of things, nowadays its ability to enhance your appreciation of the beauty of the world, for example, is increasingly important to me. But that's about just growing into something and discovering, not about moving away from something. So I can't really give you much advice, but what I think I can say is that maybe there's something that will almost be like a turning point, or you say that thinking that thought actually brought me to a point where I realized I had to rethink things in a big way. I don't know, I'm afraid, but that's what happened to me, and if it's any use to you, I'm very happy. And I'm very happy with all these questions, especially from Bolton, and it's been wonderful talking to you, and thank you for being so patient over a very long evening. Thank you.